Welcoming back Ina Fried.
Alrighty, to kick things off, our first guest is a researcher whose background is steeped in national security knowledge and major policy decisions and how AI is affecting all of that. Until recently, she was a director and board member of OpenAI, and in her recent TED Talk, which I caught in Vancouver, she called for greater transparency and auditing of how AI is being used by big tech. Please join me in welcoming Helen Toner. On the TED AI podcast that dropped last week, you shared a little bit more about the board's rationale for firing Sam Altman. You mentioned a couple things: not getting a heads up before ChatGPT launched, finding out like most of us did on Twitter, not knowing about some of his ownership involvements with a fund that invests in related companies. And I think also you felt that you were being unfairly targeted for a paper you'd written. Is that the main things, or what else was kind of, that you can talk about was going on in that decision?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's still a lot that is pretty hard to talk about, just for all kinds of legal and confidentiality reasons. But the way I would put it very briefly is essentially that we had years worth of issues with trust, accountability, oversight, and then that was really compounded by some very serious conversations we had with leadership at the company, a couple of senior executives last fall. Some of the examples you named were part of it. There are many other examples that formed a larger part of the picture. I think better not to kind of rehash it all here, but if folks are interested, they can certainly go look at that podcast episode. And I think maybe we can leave it there for now.
The rationale that you shared at the time, that the board shared, was that Sam wasn't being consistently candid. And it was interesting because at the time, I think everyone was trying to read the tea leaves. At the time, OpenAI was flying high. There was really no indications of any sort of turmoil from the outside, and it was hard to understand that idea of not being consistently candid. When you flash forward to now, we've had Scarlett Johansson in the talks, and then they went ahead with a voice that sounded like her, even though there was no deal. We had former employees saying, well, we can't really talk because we had to sign these non-disparagement clauses. Sam saying, oh, I didn't even know about them, but then if you look at the letters, Sam was the one who'd signed those. It seems like the board's arguments might have landed a bit differently if they were happening now after all this. Do you wish you'd waited a bit?
I think there's a lot of reasons we did it the way that we did, and I don't think there are big changes that I would make going back, just because of a lot of different factors that were going on at the time. Unfortunately, it's still really hard to kind of get into all the details of them. I think what we've seen over the last few months, though, is really increasing awareness and I think public understanding of the importance of governance for these companies, the importance of the processes they're using to make decisions, the importance of trust in the companies and the leadership, and I think that's only going to intensify as AI keeps getting more sophisticated.
Now, you and other folks said it wasn't, you didn't see some robots taking over behind the scenes. It wasn't some giant safety fear that led you to take what you want. At the same time, it does seem like there are a lot of concerns around safety. We've heard a lot from whether it was Jan when Ilya and Jan left. We've heard more in recent days. There's an open letter saying safety's not being taken seriously enough. And not just about OpenAI specifically, but in general, what should we be talking about when it comes to AI safety?
Yeah, I think there's a ton of different issues. AI is a very, very broad space. Lots of different kinds of safety, governance, ethics issues we could talk about. I think for a small subset of companies, there's OpenAI, but also Anthropic, Google, Meta, that are explicitly trying to build extremely advanced AI systems. Some people will call it AGI, artificial general intelligence. Other people don't like that term, myself kind of included. But I do think for those companies that are explicitly trying to build very, very advanced AI systems, that is a really ambitious goal. It is a goal they will all tell you, stands to potentially change the world, and a goal that many researchers will tell you comes along with really significant risks. So again, I think something that we're starting to see a little bit more awareness of over the last few months and years is the fact that if you're a company and you're trying to do that, that's your stated goal, I think you should be subject to a little bit more scrutiny, a little bit more questioning and the public, the government wanting to understand kind of what is it that you're doing and why do you think that it's not just safe, but also, responsible, going to, redound to the benefit of society and the public and not just to the benefit of, specific individuals at those companies. So I think there's, again, kind of almost too many different AI safety issues to try and tackle them all, but I do think there's a particular set that apply to those companies that are explicitly trying to build very advanced systems.
And I just want to highlight how unusual the set of circumstances are that we're talking about here, because I think what you're calling for is rather unprecedented. So in your TED Talk, you called for greater auditability, but also that maybe these companies should have to share what it is they're working on. Now, tech companies historically have not been sharing what they're up to, but and we've talked about this. This is an unusual moment where the absolute leading edge of the technology is not being developed by governments. It's being developed by private companies. What is reasonable to ask of private companies? I mean, they're not going to want to share everything they're doing, but what they're doing could affect all of humanity. How do we deal with that, and who's in charge? Because putting governments in charge is not always the best either.
Absolutely not. I mean, I think the kinds of policy interventions that I think make sense right now are actually not that unprecedented, not that drastic. And I think they really come from, my big picture view here is that with AI, we're in a place of huge uncertainty. So if you talk to different experts about how they expect the field to develop over the next 5 or 10 years, if you look at, the extent to which we've been surprised over the last 5 or 10 years, I think it's only reasonable to think that we shouldn't be confident one way or another what AI will look like, over the coming years. And so, for me, that leads to being interested in policy measures that can help us understand the field better, and that I think are pretty light touch, honestly. I mean, I think things like if you're spending $100 million training a frontier model, you should have to run some safety tests, and you should maybe have to report those tests or the results of those tests. That's really not a big lift.
Doing that? They're all saying they're doing that.
They're saying that they're doing the tests, but there's not a lot of standardization in what they're testing for, how they're reporting the results, are they reporting the results at all? I think there's been good progress on this, but I think we need more. I think also things like having third-party independent auditors being able to verify some of the claims that the companies are making, so that you don't just have to trust kind of the word of the corporations themselves. I mean, these are not crazy regulatory interventions. We see much heavier things in, if you look at something like food safety or you look at auto safety, like those are fields that don't stand to threaten humanity, and it's very, very normal that they're subject to regulation to make sure that the products work as they're supposed to work and that we kind of understand what's going on. So I think there's a little bit of I think our expectations around policy are a little bit wonky when it comes to tech, because we have had a few decades of the tech sector specifically being so lightly regulated relative to basically every other sector. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's obviously lots of ways to regulate in a sort of clumsy or heavy-handed way that could backfire and would not be worth it. But I also think that sometimes when I talk to folks who are in the AI sector, doing research or building AI products, they have this sense of any kind of regulation is going to be the government coming in and telling me what I can and can't do and crushing innovation and handing our lead to China, and it's all going to be terrible. And I think there's just plenty of places where that is not how regulation works. And if you can have smart people in government, which I think in this case we actually do have some pretty smart people working on AI in the US government, if you can be cautious, if you can be iterative, start small, I think there's really good prospects to introduce some really good policy measures here.
And one of the things that's always been interesting to me, and I've always pushed for, is, what is our role as citizens? And you've talked some about that. What can people who care about this, who are interested, what is your recommendation for what individuals can do to be smart citizens, to call for the right things, to put pressure on companies to behave differently? What can individuals do?
Yeah, I think, you mentioned the TED Talk I gave a month or two ago, and my kind of biggest suggestion there was to not be intimidated by this as a technology. I think people hear AI and they think, oh my goodness, that's way too complicated. I could never understand anything about it. And in some ways, there's some complicated math involved, but in other ways, it's pretty straightforward. It's really just computers trying to make predictions based on data. And it's such a wide space with so many different implications and applications that no company, no government agency can kind of understand all the ways that it's affecting our lives. And so I sort of see there as almost like In the same way that, a big advantage of markets is they can handle lots of different realities and lots of different distributed places, and you don't have one, hegemonic, Soviet control in the middle. In the same way with AI, I think there's a role for citizens to be looking at how is this affecting my life? How do I want it to affect my life? What would I hope for my computer to be able to help me with versus how is it actually harming me or taking away things that I enjoy? And just feeling entitled to that perspective and entitled to your own experience, I think is sort of the biggest thing. And then in terms of tactically, there's all the regular things. You can talk to your legislator, you can let companies know when they're doing things you don't want, you can vote with your wallet, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the sort of core underlying thing is not to think of this as a distant, mysterious, magical technology that you could never possibly kind of have a view on, but instead to just, have your own thoughts on how it's affecting you and your life and the lives of people that you know.
And, given the actions that you've taken, I think a lot of people perceive you as, against this sort of technology. You're not,
No.
from what you've told me. What do you think the technology today is good for, and what do you imagine it will soon be good for?
Yeah, I mean, what it will soon be good for is kind of, or I guess depends what we mean by soon. I think in principle, AI is, a lot of people think it could accelerate science and technology research and progress more generally. I absolutely think that technological progress is one of the best things that's happened to humanity over the last few hundred years, few thousand years. So that prospect, I think, is just very, very broadly very exciting in terms of what it could mean for our quality of life. In terms of kind of more near term, I mean, personally, I think looking at what are big problems and how could AI help with those problems is a little bit of a cliche, but you can make it very concrete. And for me, there's things as simple as, autonomous driving, where right now something like 30,000 people die every year from cars. Like, that's crazy. That's a huge problem. That's just in the US. So if we can have, and we already see in San Francisco, there's a couple of companies where you can already hail a driverless taxi. And so, yeah, I think sometimes people hear me talking about policy and risk and whatever, and they think, oh, you must be against all this stuff. But I'm so excited about autonomous vehicles. Obviously, we should test them carefully. We should check they're, as safe as human drivers. But if they are, that's such a concrete, tangible, really serious example of a problem that I think AI could solve over the next 5 or 10 years. So that's an example that I'm particularly excited about.
And in the immediate term, do you use a chatbot? Do you use today's generative AI?
I use it some. I think it can be really helpful for when you're drafting something and you want some different ideas or you want critique of what could be clearer. Personally, my favorite use for it is when there's something on the tip of your tongue and you can't quite get it. I find that chatbots are really good. You can be like, well, it kind of means this and it kind of means that, and I think it starts with P, but maybe it starts with T. They'll really help you find it quickly. Also translation. I do, a chunk of my work relates to kind of China's AI ecosystem, and I think just the way that machine translation has improved over the last 10 years has been absolutely astounding. And I'm glad that I speak enough Chinese to go in and look at original source documents, but often it's very helpful to be able to skim in English and have a high quality, English translation to be starting from.
And as you mentioned, there's a lot of risks when it comes to AI, generative AI in particular. There's the existential risks of, literally the systems taking over, but there's so many other things, whether it's amplifying existing biases, misinformation, wealth inequality, all these things. How do we have a nuanced conversation? I've always been a big advocate of we got to put existential risk, we got to have that conversation, have it off to the side, and then we have to have a conversation about other things that are not theoretical, they're here now. Misinformation, all the ones that I talked about. But we've actually debated this some, and you feel like we don't have to separate those conversations. Why not, and how should we have that conversation?
Yeah, I think it's really unfortunate that they've become such separate conversations and such separate perspectives, because I think a lot of the, if you're talking about on the one hand, a company using an AI tool for hiring and it's a discriminatory tool, and on the other hand you have an artificial general intelligence that recursively self-improves to be a superintelligence, that can seem like very, very different things. I get it. But I also think that if you're looking more broadly at I think there's many through lines between issues we're seeing here and now and issues that we might need to anticipate, different ways the technology could cause harm, could go off the rails. I think there's a lot of common threads. So things like how do we control and understand AI as a technology, or deep learning specifically, which is kind of the type of AI that is most popular, developing most rapidly right now, as you obviously know. The fact that we can't control and understand deep learning systems the same way that we understand almost any other engineered system we have is at the root of a lot of these problems in terms of what gets called the black box problem. We don't really know how they work. We don't really know how they'll fail. Also questions around kind of power, market concentration, who is making decisions, who is benefiting, I think are really common to not just questions of algorithmic bias or disinformation today, but also could have really big implications over the next few decades and could lead to sort of civilizational scale bad outcomes. I also think that sometimes people hear the phrase existential risk and they just think kind of Skynet and robots with guns like shooting down humans. And I think there's a lot of other ways that that AI could really take things in a bad direction.
Or humans could
use AI to take things in a bad direction at a global scale, at a civilizational scale. And so I think sometimes we do ourselves a disservice by kind of locking in these very specific stories of what we're talking about, as opposed to thinking sort of more holistically as this is a very powerful technology. We don't really get how it works yet. Maybe we can, later. And right now it's being developed and pushed forward by a very small group of people. And I think there's lots of different reasons to be concerned about harms that causes right now and different harms it could cause as the technology progresses.
So we only have a little bit of time left, and I kind of want to return to where we started in a sense. One of the unique things about OpenAI was they had this nonprofit structure and a board whose mission wasn't to make the most money, wasn't to be dominant. In fact, part of the mission was, if things are going in a bad direction, pull the ripcord. My feeling was always the board only had one ripcord. And my sense, even after what happened, is you guys kind of pulled that ripcord, and now OpenAI has a very different structure and a very different board. What do you hope we all take away from that moment? Because I do feel like that was the ripcord. I don't know if you have confidence that the new board would act similarly if it saw things of concern, but I feel like the old OpenAI is gone. Do you agree, and what should we have learned?
I definitely want to give the new board a chance. I think they have a lot of better structures in place that were not possible for us to put in place before November. But I do think that more broadly, it's a good demonstration of the power of profit incentives, the power of just the stakes of this technology, and the way that I think relying on corporations to self-govern and to make the right decisions, even when it goes against the interests of investors or the interests of other kind of powerful parties, is not going to be enough. And so again, I think to the extent that we think AI is going to be a powerful technology that is going to really have big effects for the world, then we shouldn't just trust private actors to get to decide what to do with it.
Well, I think this is a great way to start what I hope is going to be a fascinating day. I know we're going to dive a bunch more into a lot of these topics, and I appreciate all of your insight. Thank you very much. Helen Toner.